I think it's a really exciting time to actually have local councils considering how they can be proactive in this space. And my talk is really more about, I guess, the stick side of things and the reasons why councils should be looking at this from a legal liability point of view. But it's really fantastic that we're moving into a conversation about all the positive reasons, all the right reasons that underpin movement in this area. So I'm going to equip you all with the knowledge around the key laws in this area, and also really how promoting LGBTI inclusive practice in your work can help minimise councils' legal liabilities. But first of all, I just want to find a bit more about you. So what do you all do? Are you managers? Are you managing employees? Are you delivering services? Do people just want to shout out a couple of things just so I have a sense of who I'm talking to? What do you do? Officer. Jan, and we've got some local councillors.
Today I'm a councillor.
Yep.
Councillor as well.
Yeah.
We hunt in packs.
Does anyone in the audience sort of deliver services to the community? Yeah, that's a lot. And who manages staff? Okay. So these are the key areas where government, local government does have responsibilities and exposure, I guess, to LGBTI discrimination issues. And the main one is service delivery, and goods and services are a key area of activity where councils need to be thinking about making sure they're not discriminating against LGBTI people, and preferably proactively thinking about how to better include the needs of LGBTI people in their service delivery. There's also responsibilities as an employer, and there's also making of local laws and those instruments, and this is where the councillors need to think about what they're doing and making sure that they're including the needs, the human rights of LGBTI people in that process. So what laws are we talking about? There's a mixture of state and federal. The Sex Discrimination Act, and most importantly some amendments that were passed in 2013, protects LGBTI people from discrimination. And then we already had Victorian laws that did that in the Equal Opportunity Act. We also have the Fair Work Act, which relates specifically to employees, obviously. And in the Victorian Charter, we have a whole bunch of different human rights protected, but there's some particular ones that relate, I think, specifically to LGBTI people or are particularly relevant, and that's right to equality before the law and non-discrimination, and the right to privacy and protection of your reputation. So this is just to give you a graphical depiction of how all these laws intersect. But it is, it's a complex terrain legally. We're not going to get through all that today, but it's really just to give you a sense of what's out there and the key concepts. So we talk a lot about discrimination, but I think I just wanted to start with what do we actually mean when we talk about discrimination and equality, because as people have described it, it is actually one of those treacherously simple concepts that are talked about a lot. But actually when you try and unpack what it means, it can get pretty complicated, and we're not going to cover the whole political philosophy traditions of the last centuries in today's talk, but just to give you a bit of a sense of some key concepts. An important one is the concept of formal equality, and that's really embodied in prohibitions against direct discrimination. And this means when you treat someone fairly, you're treating them fairly when you treat them the same. So that was sort of the original idea of equality, that you don't pay any regard to people's differences. You say, I'm going to give Sean a Mars bar because he gave such a great speech, and then I'll give Jan a Mars bar too. So I'm treating them equally. But then if you have a look at this picture in the next slide, it's clear that when you treat some people the same, you actually are treating them differently. Their outcome is not as good as the other. This means that our discrimination laws have to actually grapple with the idea of what is called substantive equality, or making sure that we look at the outcomes for people. And in the law, that's embodied in provisions that protect against indirect discrimination. So, to give you a bit of an overview, our laws in Australia that protect against discrimination are basically a statutory scheme. They've developed alongside civil rights movements throughout history and also reflect international human rights law. What they basically mean is, that means in practice is that it develops a cause of action. So when someone treats you unfairly because of a particular attribute, it's a wrong against you, so you have a civil claim against that person. And the best way to think about it is firstly starting with the Sex Discrimination Act or the Equal Opportunity Act. They have certain spheres of coverage or areas of life, and we've already talked about service delivery and employment being two particular ones that are relevant to council. And you first start with, well, are we talking about conduct that's occurred in a sphere of life that's covered by discrimination law? Then you think about, well, do we have a protected, what's called a protected attribute involved? And that's where, in this case, we're talking about sexual orientation, gender identity, or intersex status. And then you get down to the nitty-gritty of whether the treatment was unlawful. So I think that's sort of a good way of thinking through the issue, or asking a lawyer to think through the issue when you have a problem that comes across your desk. The word protected attribute's a bit of a funny one, but that's what we talk about in the law. Basically, we're talking about characteristics that are inherent to a person. And people often talk about discrimination and say, well, I'm a dog owner, I'm not a cat owner, and I'm being discriminated against because I'm a dog owner. And that's why it's really important that we have protected attributes, because in discrimination law, being a dog owner isn't a protected attribute. So if you're a council worker and someone comes up to you and says, well, I'm being discriminated against because I'm a dog owner, you can quite confidently say, sorry, it may be that you're being treated differently, or there's different rules that apply, but because discrimination law doesn't have protections for dog owners, we focus on attributes like race, gender, disability, sexual orientation. That's actually not unlawful discrimination. So the protected attributes that I want to talk a bit more about today are relationship status, sexual orientation, gender identity, and intersex status. And the words used in the law won't always necessarily reflect how people talk about their sexual or gender identities, but that doesn't matter. They're very broad, inclusive definitions, and you have to think about how they apply to the situation in front of you. So I want to unpack these protected attributes a bit more, and I'm going to focus on the Sex Discrimination Act. Sexual orientation is, I think, the easy one, and relationship status and marital status, I think, hopefully are concepts that people are familiar with. Sexual orientation, interestingly, covers not just homosexuality or bisexuality, as Sean was explaining earlier, but also heterosexuality. So keep that in mind, and we'll get to this a bit later, but it's you have to think about whether your policies discriminate against heterosexual people as well. Gender identity is an attribute that protects transgender people, gender diverse people. That's the groups it's aimed at protecting. And the definition that we find in our federal law is a very broad one. So have a look at it, let's have a read of what it says. It means the gender-related identity, appearance, or mannerisms, or other gender-related characteristics of a person, whether by way of medical intervention or not, with or without regard to the person's sex designated at birth. So there's a lot in there that's quite interesting. I find it interesting that we're talking about not just the way someone identifies, but the way that gender is expressed. So really, this is so broad that it could actually cover, say, a butch lesbian, needn't be a transgender person, but if a woman or even a straight woman has a masculine presentation who expresses herself by not wearing dresses, and you have a dress code in place at a workplace that says women must wear dresses and men must wear trousers, then that's going to impact unfairly on a woman that doesn't feel comfortable wearing dresses, and that's something that you need to think about when you're reviewing that policy. It also references medical intervention, and it specifically says that medical intervention isn't required. So when if you have forms that, or you collect information about sex and gender, and someone comes to you and says, I've changed my gender marker, and or I now identify as a woman and I used to identify as a man, can I please change that on my council record? The council has to think about, well, are we going to require someone to produce some piece of information, a birth certificate, a medical certificate, before we allow that change? And I would argue that you shouldn't be requiring any evidence to facilitate that change, because the protection in the law specifically says you can't be discriminated against just because you don't have a medical certificate that proves your gender identity. Does anyone have any questions? I mean, feel free to shout out with questions as we go along, but are people with me so far? Yes, I'm getting some nods. Feel free to ask any questions at any time, I should say. So how are we feeling about gender identity? Where it's broad, covers expression, it covers identity, it's aimed at trans people, it could cover butch lesbians or effeminate men. Yes?
Probably more of a comment. Like, I really like your idea about not having to provide documentation, but you pretty much can't pick up a pen in council without documentation. So you can't do anything. You can't do anything in council without documentation.
Yeah.
So, like, how do you go about that? That seems like a huge sphere to me, really.
It is a huge sphere, and I guess there's a question the council needs to ask itself before it even gets to the point of people requesting changes around gender markers or gender classifications, which is, do we need to even collect this information at all? And it's really important to keep in mind, and I'm sure you'll hear more about this throughout the day, that trans and gender diverse and intersex people find that information quite personal, and so arguably asking for it is that has an impact on them, so that councils need to be mindful of. So when you're putting together a form and requesting information from people, I think it's really important to think about why are you requesting the information? Why do we need it? Is it for a beneficial reason? Is it to make sure that the council's not favouring men over women in the provision of particular services? If so, I think that's a good thing. Or we want to make sure that we're not, our boards have got a good number of women on them, and that type of reason. One option could be similar to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander identification, is making that sort of information voluntary for people. So making it clear that people needn't provide information about their gender, but if they wish to do so, they can. And you could even do that with questions around LGBTI, sort of where appropriate, and make it clear in the data collection that you're doing it so that the council has a good sense of the population and can better tailor its services to the needs of particular vulnerable groups. But documentation and data is a huge area, so you're spot on. Okay, this is the new kid on the block, intersex status. We were the first country in the world to include a separate protected attribute of intersex status. And as Sean explained earlier, we're talking about people who have, I missed Rowena's talk, I should say. So Bro, you might have covered this already. No? We're talking about people that have genetic, hormonal, physical features that are neither exclusively male or female. Now these people may identify as male or female, or as neither or both. The majority of intersex people generally identify as a man or as a woman, and you won't necessarily know that they have an intersex condition or variation. It was really important though to have this attribute included in federal discrimination law because it raised awareness and visibility about this particular population group, and we're talking about a population group that's about as common as Down syndrome. So they're a cohort that's particularly poorly understood, and you know, I know that the Victorian government's doing some work already to better understand their needs, but local councils, you know, it's good for you to be aware of the existence of this group and the fact that your policies and programs should be inclusive of their needs as well. Oh, we should talk about an example. Let's talk about an example. So one example that was given to me when we were arguing for inclusion of this attribute was an intersex woman who was taken to hospital to have a procedure, and she was housed in a women's ward, and because her genitalia, the staff thought that her genitalia, which had a mixture of some more masculine characteristics as well as female characteristics, would be confronting to the other women in that ward. She was put in a broom closet as an alternative because they didn't want to put her in a male ward. Now, she found that incredibly distressing, and there's steps that the hospital should have taken to make sure that this person didn't suffer that indignity and treatment simply because she had that presentation of her genitalia. I mean, how about some curtains around the bed? I mean, it's just ridiculous. So unfortunately, those stories are far too common. I talked a bit about the protected spheres of life before, but I just wanted to tell you, this is not a comprehensive list, but this is the majority of the areas of we say protected spheres of life under the Victorian and the federal discrimination laws. You can see that there's a lot there that local councils are involved with. I mean, do local councils do accommodation? Sometimes. But obviously employment. Do they do education? Sometimes. Sport, clubs, obviously provision of goods and services, and not so much provision of Commonwealth laws and programs, but I think, you know, there's a good portion of those that councils are involved in. There's also some exceptions in the Act, or exemptions, depending on what word you prefer. But I won't go through all of these, but just to be aware that it's not, there's particular provisions that are relevant, for instance, to religious organisations, to charities, to single-sex services, and that can get a bit tricky when you're talking about transgender and intersex people. But just be aware of those. So if you go through that analysis of, oh, am I talking about a protected sphere of life? Do I have a person with a protected attribute? Have they been treated unfairly? It may still be that an exception applies. And one relevant exception in the data area is that organisations aren't compelled to collect data for non-binary identified people at the moment. So did that make sense? So you don't have to collect. I think the government, the Parliament at the time recognised that that would probably be a bit too soon to require all businesses in Australia to collect male, female and any other identification that falls outside male or female. So that is one specific statutory exception, which isn't to say that best practice wouldn't be collecting sex and gender information in a way that's inclusive of people that don't identify as male or female. I always put these in, but like, thankfully you guys don't need to worry about this so much. But obviously this is one of the more controversial exemptions in both the state and federal law, is the one for religious organisations. But then we get down to the question of whether the unfair treatment is unlawful or not. And that's where we come to the concepts of direct and indirect discrimination. Direct discrimination is a bit easier to identify but it's much rarer because it's very rare that you actually say to someone, look, I'm not offering you this job because you're gay. That doesn't happen very often.
Except for me.
Yeah. Hopefully that doesn't happen very often. When it does, you've got a really strong claim, so you should definitely go to see a lawyer. Or if they're thinking they don't want to offer it to you because they're gay, it's very rare to have evidence of that which is really unfortunate for people that are victims of discrimination. Where I think the councils will have, you need to do some more thinking in reviews of policies and procedures is this concept of indirect discrimination. So when a condition, requirement or practice is neutral on its face, but when it is applied to a group of people, like whether it's a trans person, a same-sex attracted person, it actually disadvantages that group. And one example would be saying that everyone at work has an entitlement to maternity leave and parental leave. But if you define maternity leave as only applying to mothers who give birth to their children, then you're disadvantaging lesbians because obviously often inevitably one female in that couple is not going to give birth. They may still want to access some form of parental leave, but that policy, which on its face looks like it applies the same to everyone, actually disadvantages people. And this was actually a real life example that Sean and I came across when working together at the lobby. A council worker and her partner approached us. The woman that was giving birth was a casual worker at the casino, so she didn't have any paid parental leave entitlements. And the way the EBA that was worded for the council worker specified that maternity leave was available for women that gave birth and parental leave was available for men. So there was actually no provision for same-sex couples. And that's why gendered language is really important to look at in all of your contracts, whether they're employment contracts, whether they're instruments under awards, or whether it's contracts with companies that provide services that you subcontract out. It's really important to, I think, like looking for references to gender is a real flag for spotting instances where policies might detrimentally impact on LGBTI people. The get out of jail part of indirect discrimination is that there's the defence of reasonableness, and that's why it's quite hard to prove these cases in court. Or it can be. Yeah.
In the instance that you just provided there, is that where you were suggesting that heterosexual couples, for instance, are also discriminated against, for instance, if they can't biologically or adopt children, like, would that be an example?
Yeah, that would be an example. I mean, so if a heterosexual couple had engaged in altruistic surrogacy and had a child, and that mother wouldn't be entitled to access that maternity leave provision as well. So actually, that actually might make this is the problem with discrimination law. You need to have a comparator to prove the claim, and sometimes the comparators the courts choose are really quite odd. So a court could say, well, the same-sex couple isn't discriminated against because a heterosexual couple in a similar situation would also not be able to access the entitlement. So that's why, in the words of Justice Michael Kirby, the field of discrimination law is littered with the bodies of the wounded, not to be overly dramatic, because it is really hard to actually go through the steps of proving a discrimination claim and winning in court. But thankfully, hopefully, if councils are doing the right thing, people won't need to make complaints in the first place. Right, okay. All you need to know about the state law is it's generally the same as the law that I've just described. except that it's a no-cost jurisdiction, so you're probably going to more likely get complaints coming on your desk from the Equal Opportunity Act in Victoria. For LGBTI people, the definitions of gender identity and intersex are not ideal under Victorian law. We're working to change that. But there's also a positive duty under Victorian law, and this applies to service providers, employers, so local councils, to eliminate discrimination as far as possible. So you actually actively have to be looking at everything you do to make sure that you're not discriminating. I mentioned positive discrimination, which is in the context of there being protections for heterosexual people as well. And all you need to know here is that it's not unlawful or illegal to do good things for LGBTI people. So if you have a special program targeted at the needs of a particular vulnerable group, whether that's LGBTI people or women or Aboriginal people, there's provision under both state and federal law for special measures to address historical disadvantage. There's also the ability to apply for a exemption from VCAT, for instance, under Victorian law. So if you get some legal advice and you're a bit nervous about the specific program or special measure, you can actually apply to the court and have the certainty of a court order before you engage in what we, in layperson's terms, is positive discrimination. Fair Work Act, all we really need to know is that there's also exposure for employees, and the Fair Work Act is often used as a faster and more accessible regime. These are protections on the basis of sexual orientation, not gender identity or intersex status, unfortunately. I'm going to skip through the charter. Who's had charter training before? Oh, that's good. So, as a council worker or decision maker, you all have obligations under the charter, and that really requires you to take into account human rights, a number of human rights in your decision making. But also it has impacts on the way that the courts interpret legislation as well. Go through this quickly. Does it apply to you? Yes. What it means in practice is that when you're making decisions that affect people, you need to take account for their human rights. It means you need to act compatibly with human rights. And if you don't feel like you know how to do that, ask your boss for some training. Some particular rights that are relevant to LGBTI people, like I flagged at the introduction, the right to equality and non-discrimination. So it means that for all of our human rights, whether it's privacy, whether it's freedom from torture and ill treatment, whether it's security and liberty of person, whether it's the right to a fair trial, the ability to exercise those rights for LGBTI people shouldn't be any poorer than any other group in society. Privacy is, I think, an important one for LGBTI people as well. So in broad terms, councils have an obligation not to arbitrarily or unlawfully interfere with people's privacy or their reputation. And for coming back to that issue around gender and sex information, for example, and data collection, that would be one I think that's relevant there. So making sure that you're respecting people's privacy when you do ask for information. We've already gone through that case study. I'm not sure if councils provide domestic violence services, but just in terms of service delivery, and again, bearing in mind there's some exemptions for single-sex service delivery. Whenever you have a service that's available either in practice or formally only available to one sex or gender, I think it's really important to think about making sure that trans people, so trans women, have access to women's services, for example. Sean and I are both aware of examples of trans women being turned away from crisis accommodation and women's refuges, which has been really unfortunate. Then there's just being a bit more aware and sensitive to the fact that LGBTI people exist and are out there. And that's, for instance, in this example, we're talking about a couple entering a residential facility, and because Mary didn't feel comfortable revealing that her friend was actually her partner, the partner wasn't given the same sorts of visiting and decision-making rights. And unfortunately, the lack of recognition of same-sex partners is actually quite prevalent within hospitals and aged care facilities. Things are getting better, but it's something that I think as service providers, and particularly when you're dealing with vulnerable groups, older people, people with disabilities, people that might feel they need to go back into the closet when they're going into aged care, for example, I think it's really important that councils, when they're delivering services, make every effort to send those signals about visibility, those visible signals about inclusivity. So simple things like that have already been mentioned, like having pictures of same-sex couples, having little rainbow flags up in your waiting rooms, all sorts of signs that make LGBTI people feel comfortable and confident to come out themselves to you, and that they're going to get good service. Sorry, where I'm heading, but some simple things that councils can do that I would suggest, and I'm sure there's going to be lots of good discussion about this today, and some other good suggestions, is review your policies and processes for gender-neutral language and inclusion of LGBTI people. Wherever you've got other particular vulnerable groups or communities mentioned in any of your policies, if you've set up specific processes for CALD or people with disability or Aboriginal people, have a think about whether there needs to be other LGBTI specific programs or particular mechanisms. For example, I know some councils have introduced reference groups, which I think is a really good way for councils to get advice and input from LGBTI communities into their work. I also put in there, consider paying sitting fees, because you'll probably hear later on today, trans, gender diverse and intersex people in particular, because there seems to be less of them active in community work, are drawn upon a lot for advice, and have a think about, particularly when it comes to intersex and trans issues, if you need to run some training, if you need to run a seminar on a particular issue, offer to pay those advocates for their time, because these people are volunteers and they're not employed to do what they do. As an employer, councils can join Pride and Diversity, you can run training, and obviously consider the needs of LGBTI people at every stage of your planning for program and policy development. So those are some ideas from me. I'm sure there'll be some other great ideas. I'm sure you've got some great ideas already. And before I close, I'd just like to see if anyone has any questions.